rassemblés de façon virtuelle plus de 1000 participants pour discuter des thèmes autour de combler les clivages. Today we have less than 60 minutes, so that means less intro and more discussion of great theme with a great session moderated by Dr. Susan Breaux, Dean of Law at the University of Victoria, who will introduce the panel and frame the conversation. On n'a que 60 minutes, alors juste très bref, et ça me fait plaisir de passer la parole au Dr. Susan Breaux, doyenne de la faculté de droit à l'Université de Victoria, qui va présenter le panel et cadrer la conversation. Over to you. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Ambassador Boileau. It's a real honor and pleasure to welcome you virtually to this first webinar of our series. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationship with this lands continues to this day. Many of us are meeting in this virtual space from locations outside of Victoria and indeed across the world. So I would like also to acknowledge the lands on which you live and work. Now, I am just absolutely delighted to participate in this panel and to hear our brilliant speakers talk about a subject that's so near and dear to my heart, rebuilding trust in democratic institutions. For the past 4 or 5 years, I've been extremely concerned about the erosion in democracy around the world. Just as we are speaking, we have a military coup in Myanmar, with many people now dying in the streets. And yesterday, I had the opportunity to watch the Senate hearings about what is now being called insurrection, the storming of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., and how close it got to the cradle of democracy really being overrun, and a democratically elected president not being confirmed in his office. Now, we're not here to talk about all of the disasters that have happened to democracy in the last few years. What I like about the Victoria Forum and the focus of Bridging Divides is that we are a solution-based group. We are interested in attempting to talk about the difficulties, but how we might indeed get back on course to preserving and building democracy, because democracy needs building with the desperate socio-economic divides that have only increased in the past century. Democracy needs rebuilding. And so our panelists today are going to be talking about these issues. I have a couple of housekeeping items to share. The chat function is not available for this webinar. We welcome you to join the conversation and submit your questions through the question and answers button, which is at the bottom of your screen. Those questions will be compiled together, and we will be asking the panelists your question, as many as we can get to. This session is being recorded and available at victoriaforum.com within 1 week. Now, without further ado, I want to get to our amazing panel. First, I'd like to introduce Her Honor, the Honorable Janet Austin, who was sworn in as the 30th Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia on April 24th, 2018. Prior to her appointment, she spent 15 years as Chief Executive Officer of the YWCA Metro Vancouver, one of the province's largest and most diversified nonprofits. There, she oversaw operations delivering services to tens of thousands of people at more than 40 locations. Raised in Alberta, Her Honor spent her early year in public sector roles in Calgary, working in regional planning and public consultation and communications for provincial government. She eventually moved to BC, where she began working with the BC Housing and discovered her passion and aptitude for public office. Prior to joining the YWCA, Her Honor served as Executive Director of the Big Sisters of British Columbia, Lower Mainland, and actively volunteered for many organizations in commitment to helping improving the lives of others, as well as serving on various boards ranging from TransLink to the Women's Health Research Initiative. Her Honor is Chancellor of the Order of British Columbia and was invested as a member of the Order in 2016. As Lieutenant Governor, she's identified 3 key themes for her mandate: the promotion of diversity and inclusion, democracy, and civic engagement and reconciliation. Please welcome Her Honor Janet Austin. Janet, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bro. Bonjour and good morning, friends. I'm speaking to you today from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen peoples, the Songhees and Esquimalt. And so I will say to you in Sinchasan, Ait Squaichel, Stedacha, Aikwanas Quinangahela, which means, good day, dear friends. It's wonderful to be among you today. And I mean that so very sincerely. Like all of you, I have found myself increasingly concerned about the fragility of democracy in the current global context. More and more, we are seeing that even the most seemingly stable of societies can be subject to authoritarian capture. This sad reality has impaired the ability of many governments to respond effectively to the current global pandemic. But it's worth remembering that this past year has also brought a generous sharing of new knowledge, built trust among traditional adversaries, and we better understand our mutual interdependence. It has taught us patience, compassion, and humility, and caused us to reflect seriously on systemic racism and social and economic inequalities. In recent years, there's been much valuable work done to understand the conditions that have led to the weakening of democracies around the world, work that has left us with some, what I call, existential questions. What are the factors that inspire solidarity and a commitment to collective action and shared prosperity? Or alternatively, can tip a society into division, inequality, and instability? How do we rebuild trust in democratic institutions and strengthen civility, respect, and goodwill across partisan divides? And what is the future we want for our country and the world? Unfortunately, there are no easy answers. Nonetheless, I remain fundamentally optimistic. Here in Canada, I believe we are seeing renewed respect for the foundational values of diversity, pluralism, and inclusion, tempered by a recognition that the equal society we aspire to is not a reality for many, and that we have work to do. I'm excited about our conversation today because it is focused on future-oriented solutions, and indeed, there are many areas where progress can be made. We need standards and a regulatory framework to deal with the growth of technology and new media and to share the benefits more fairly. We need to be clear-eyed in responding to the labor force implications of artificial intelligence to ensure that people are not left behind. We need to support young people to build political, economic, and media literacy through greater educational emphasis on governance systems and processes. And I tip my hat to the University of Victoria for the work they're doing on students' dialogue on democratic engagement. We need to incent and build a culture of civility and respect in public and political discourse. And I point to the work of the Union of BC Municipalities on strengthening responsible conduct as evidence that this can in fact be done. We need a long-term foreign policy perspective, strengthened multilateralism, and a global vaccine strategy for now and for the future, and many other things. But what I want to say to you today is that work starts with each one of us. We can all make a conscious effort to reach out and engage deeply and constructively with those whose views are different from our own, and to enter these conversations with a genuine desire to listen, with curiosity and a willingness to alter our positions when confronted with superior arguments, well supported and well argued. This is not a trivial thing. As citizens, we can do our part by being active in civil society and promoting the active engagement of others. Our democratic conventions and public institutions may not be perfect, but they are fundamental to a viable democracy. If we want them to survive and thrive, we must actively support them. And if we are to overcome our global challenges, I believe it must be through greater collaboration and sharing, through robust but respectful dialogue based on shared facts and agreed principles of engagement. Finally, I leave you with a quote from Archibald MacLeish. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. And it is, "Democracy is never a thing done. Democracy is always something that a nation must be doing." Haïchka, merci. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Your Honor, for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here today and help us navigate through this timely topic. The words that stay in my mind from your talk are collaboration, civility, listening, I think that is what we're here to do, and I'm delighted by your opening. Thank you so much. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Juan Jose Debub. Dr. Juan Jose Debub, PhD, is the chairman and CEO of the Debub Partnership, an initiative of ARCIS LLC, dedicated to delivering results for public and private organizations around the world. He is also the founding chief executive officer of the Global Adaptation Institute and co-chair of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Climate Change. He has taught at Princeton University and is a member of several board of directors, including in the US, Europe, the Middle East, and Latin America. As managing director of the World Bank from 2006 to 2010, Dr. Debub oversaw operations in 110 countries throughout Africa, the Middle East, East Asia, and Latin America. He was also responsible for the oversight of the Human Development and Sustainable Development Networks, the Information Systems Group, the World Bank Institute, and the Department of Institutional Integrity. He has spoken extensively at high-level international conferences on economic freedom, prosperity, and development issues, including the World Economic Forum, the Union for the Mediterranean, the World Bank IMF Annual Meeting, the OECD, Transparency International, the BOAO Forum, and the Atlantic Basin Initiative. Prior to the World Bank, Dr. Debub led the expansion of his family-owned businesses and worked for nonprofits on public policies to promote liberty, stability, and growth throughout Latin America. From 1999 to 2004, Dr. Debub served concurrently as El Salvador's Minister of Finance and as Chief of Staff to the President. In these high-profile dual roles, Dr. Debub helped to navigate his native country through several regional economic challenges, including securing and sustaining El Salvador's investment-grade rating, dollarizing the economy, and completing a free trade agreement with the U.S. During this period, he also oversaw the emergency reconstruction of El Salvador after two major earthquakes in 2001. He holds a Bachelor of Science, Master's of Science, and PhD in Industrial Engineering from North Carolina State University. He is married to Gloribel Silhi de Debub. They have 4 children and live in Potomac, Maryland, USA. I'd like to turn the talk over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. It's a pleasure, and thank you for the invitation to the Victoria Forum. It's always a great opportunity to share some ideas, and not the least in the important topic that we have at hand today. And I am going to take a look more from the situation of developing countries, so that developed nations like Canada can probably compare and contrast how far or how close we are in terms of achieving really a strong and working democratic institutions. So as many of you know, several countries do not yet have fully functioning democratic institutions, and so we cannot talk about rebuilding something that doesn't exist yet. And then we see many other countries that indeed have, or have had for many years, well-functioning democratic institutions, and yet the conversation is about rebuilding them. I tend to believe that economic growth and security are the 2 pillars that generate the social stability that is needed for that social contract in a country to appreciate the importance and the relevance and the work of institutions. It is also important to say that democracy is not an end, but rather is an enabler, perhaps the best enabler we currently know. And so I like to, in the 5 minutes that we have been given, 4 minutes left, basically share very quickly the experience of my own country, El Salvador, and then how that experience I somehow saw it happening or were able to input some of those ideas into the rest of the world where I had a chance to work while at the World Bank. So El Salvador is a country that many of you know had a civil war. It was actually an invasion organized by the Soviet Union using Cuba to impose a model that we in El Salvador didn't want. That war that was between 1978 and 1992 killed 5% of our population. 22% of our population migrated primarily to the United States, and the credibility of the country was zero. Same thing for institutions. we were able, many of us from civil society, to join a new government and implement a series of policies that work. El Salvador was in a hardship position, and yet we were able, in a short period of time, in 6 years, from 1992 that we signed the peace agreement to 1998, to open our economy, to create and strengthening institutions. And one of the metrics we like to use is that we were able to achieve investment grade, second only to Chile, but not only that, looking at indices like the Index of Economic Freedom or Transparency International indicators, but the Index of Economic Freedom, El Salvador was number 13 in the world, in a better position than Germany, than France, that Chile, that Spain, that many other countries around the world. Yet, after a period of time, concretely after 12 years of that process of reforms, we ended up having a government that was a populistic government, and then the communists took power for 10 years. During that period, the institutions that we have been able to build were captured and were misused, and therefore the citizens again started to distrust institutions. What happened is that we lost the investment grade and we basically went back to square one. So today, regrettably, my country, in every metric you can see and measure, has gone back to about the same standards that we had during the bad decade, the decades of the war. So what I'm trying to say here is that we didn't have institutions. We were able to build them and produce results for the people. People were able to take destiny into their own hands, and the country was doing extremely well. When people sort of decided that those institutions were no longer what they wanted, or certain elites, chronic capitalists, some members of unions and others captured some of these institutions, the credibility was lost. Wrong, in my view, governments took place, and the country again went back to square one. When I was at the World Bank, I was able to work with 110 countries. And what I'm describing, to an extent, to a certain degree, is basically the same. Distrust to certain institutions, capture of those institutions by certain elites, and the only solution, where I have seen it work, is where one is able to remove the obstacles for people to take destiny into their own hands, for the private sector to create jobs, which are very important for people not to depend on anybody. So for that to happen, you need, and that will produce economic growth, but you need the security, and that combination of economic growth and security leads to social stability and to a scenario where one can then have the right combination of democratic institutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. DeVoe. And I just want to mention a couple of key themes that you stated. One, I mean, you've reminded us that that democratic institutions need building, that economic development and trust in institutions are so important as part of that package of building democratic institutions. And I thank you so much for those wise words and contribution. We'll have a chance to discuss this further later on. Our final speaker is Ben Roswell, who joins us with an extensive history of global interactions, which I'm sure will lend well to this conversation. Ben has been president and research director of the Canadian International Council since November 2018. Ben, I'm a proud member of that council.
Glad to hear.
Prior to the CIC, Ben served as Canada's ambassador to Venezuela from 2014 to 2017. This capped a 25-year career as a professional diplomat, including assignments in Canada's embassies to Egypt, the United States, and Canada's permanent mission to the UN. He served as Canada's first diplomatic envoy to Baghdad, Iraq, after the fall of Saddam Hussein from 2003 to 2005, as Deputy Ambassador to Afghanistan, and as head of the NATO Provincial Reconstruction Team in Kandahar between 2008 and 2010. As a practitioner of international relations, Ben's thematic interest has been in human rights and democracy. He founded the Democracy Unit at Global Affairs Canada and worked closely with human rights activists in Iraq and Afghanistan. As ambassador to Venezuela, Ben was an outspoken advocate of the restoration of popular sovereignty of Venezuelans after the suspension of the constitutional order in 2017. These experiences abroad awakened an interest in the role of citizens in their own democracy. In Ottawa, Ben supported the cabinet process as a member of the Privy Council office during the tenures of Jean Chrétien and Stephen Harper, experiences that exposed him to the far-reaching impact that public opinion has on decision-making at the highest levels of government. Ben brings the passion for the role of the individual citizen to the CIC, a platform for everyday Canadians to participate in national conversations about our nation's, and I'm going to add an editorial comment, critical role in the world. Thank you, Ben, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Brault, and to the Victoria Forum, Ambassador Beaulieu, for the opportunity to speak with you and to be part of such a distinguished panel. It's a real honor for me. I thought I might start with my experience in Venezuela because I did have a sort of front row seat at the demise of one historic and very proud democracy in our hemisphere, and then relate that to our situation in Canada. Now, they might seem like two very different countries, and obviously we're talking about two very different political situations. But Venezuela actually has a much longer and stronger and prouder history of democracy and human rights than I think many Canadians might appreciate. It was the very first country in all of Latin America to overthrow military dictatorship in the 1950s, about 30 years before most other countries. And it was the refuge for democracy and human rights activists throughout the war. So any of you who've read, Isabel Allende and some of her wonderful books about her native Chile and about the struggle for democracy there, well, those were written in Caracas because it was a magnet for lovers of democracy and human rights throughout all of the hemispheres for so many decades. So if what happened in Venezuela could happen in a country that was that stable and that with that long and proud a history of democracy, it could happen anywhere. I don't have much time in my 5 minutes to go through a blow by blow of what happened, but just to say that between the time I arrived there in 2014 and when I left in 2017, there was a very significant deterioration in the democratic situation. When I arrived, Venezuela, yes, was a very, very polarized country. Between rich and poor, urban and rural, and in the throes of a major political crisis. But there was a tremendous hope for change, that the political process, that the democracy that still existed up until that time in somewhat damaged form was still able to deliver the kind of change. And there was a tremendous amount of energy in the street that Venezuelans of many different political persuasions shared that conviction that they could really bring things around, that they could change things through the political system. And it was quite inspiring to me. What our embassy did was what I think all embassies do and should do, which is to get to know as many Venezuelans as possible at all different levels of society, to really understand the full breadth and diversity of the Venezuelan experience and how they experience their government and their political system. And so we were the embassy that was best known for going into some of the poor barrios, the shanty towns, or some of the poor areas that were traditional support for the then government. And it was in the process of doing that we learned that actually Venezuela was not as polarized as the politicians led us to believe. That in fact, there certainly was divisions between rich and poor. There's no doubt about that, and differences of opinion on what the policies of the government should be. But there was a tremendous amount of common values, of common connection, of real pride for the country, and real pride for the history of democracy and human rights, and growing concern across the entire population at the deteriorating economic and humanitarian position. What had happened by 2017, essentially, is that hope for change had died out after massive, absolutely massive street protests that eventually included the entire country, every single walk of life, every single economic and socio-economic class, all around the country, not just in Caracas, really the entire nation rising up and demanding kind of change. It was an extraordinary effort, a collective effort by the people of Venezuela and it didn't work. It didn't bring the change that was so desperately needed as people were starting to starve to death, essentially. The levels of economic crisis that were causing widespread malnutrition, a total collapse in the healthcare system, the rise of unnecessary medical deaths. We're talking about tens of thousands of people dying unnecessarily, maybe hundreds of thousands. There was a desperate need for change. And yet with the suspension of the Constitution and the use of force to suppress these protests, the hope went out in Venezuela. I don't think it's gone out forever because, as I say, there's a really deep commitment. But a few things that I would say, some lessons from Venezuela. The first is that polarization is a cancer. It will kill democracy in any country where it's allowed to proceed unchecked. The second is to beware politicians that claim their country is more polarized than it might in fact actually be. Politicians that benefit from the perception of polarization. Politicians that get their own power, not by advancing the interests of the people, but by saying, you need me in order to beat the other side. The most important thing is to defeat the other side, and that's why you should elect me. That is the path to authoritarianism. The focus should always be on the citizens. So 3 things. First of all, we should always be combating polarization wherever we find it. Secondly, focus on the needs of the citizens themselves. That's the path to finding a common understanding. And third, have to maintain hope for change. That means that we have to constantly be trying to figure out how to make our democracy work, as our previous speakers have said. Just to touch quickly on Canada in the small amount of time that I have now. I'm very happy to have left government and much as I enjoyed my career that I used to share with Ambassador Beaulieu, and to be in civil society. The CIC is an engine for depolarization, in a sense. We are a membership-based organization in 17, soon to be 18 cities across this country, and we bring Canadians of all different ideologies and all different perspectives to the table. Often foreign policy is seen as something for the lead, or maybe just for the people in the sort of Ottawa, Montreal, Toronto triangle. We've got our largest CIC branch is actually in Victoria, though, by far the largest branch in the whole country. But we've even opened up in Prince George. We're quite active in Thunder Bay and places where you wouldn't normally think about foreign policy. We're trying to apply some of the lessons that I saw in Venezuela. So when it comes to focusing on the citizens, we're trying to engage everyday Canadians in a conversation of foreign policy, not leaving this to the experts in Ottawa. For all the respect I have for my former colleagues, foreign policy affects all of us. Think about COVID. I mean, many people don't think of this as a foreign policy issue, but the pathogen came from abroad. The vaccines come from abroad. It's our interaction with the world, which has both led so many of us to get sick and die, and it's the interaction that we have with the rest of the world, which is going to allow us to inoculate our population and to recover from this. So the international dimension is central to the experience we have as citizens. And that's what we're trying to do in the CIC, to bring citizens back into that conversation and ultimately to build that hope for change that even in a longstanding democracy like ours, there's always better that we can do.
Ben, thank you so much. One of the themes that really struck me and in my study of history is that exploitation of divide, of amplifying that divide to obtain power. That's a theme that is, that has led to the rise of many, many dictators. And I thank you for that. Now we are ready, if our panelists would please join me. A quick reminder of housekeeping. The chat function is not available. We welcome you to join this conversation and submit your questions through Q&A, which is at the bottom of the screen. If you are just joining us, the session will be recorded and available at victoriaforum.com within 1 week. Now, I'd like to just begin the conversation and ask the panelists to comment on this critical question. It's sort of the chicken and the egg question. Is the erosion of trust in democratic institutions the cause or the consequence of socio-economic divides? Let's start with Janet.
Okay.
If you don't mind, Janet, if I use your first name.
That's absolutely fine. Always among friends, as we are. I'm very comfortable with that, so thank you. I think, I think they're mutually reinforcing. I think that's a very complicated question, and I don't think that you can identify one or other factor as the key one. But as trust erodes in democratic processes, as certainly as we've heard from both Ben and Dr. Dabu, we see this continued erosion of equality norms, and of course this becomes mutually reinforcing. I don't have the expertise that the others do. I'm sure they can probably give you a much more sophisticated answer.
Juan?
So I'm usually not politically correct, so let me just express myself as openly as I can. But if by democratic institutions we understand the establishment, the bureaucracy, or the status quo of some countries, then I think they are the cause of many or some of the socioeconomic divide or challenges that are out there. So if we accept that definition, then I think it's the cause. At the same time, I have also observed certain countries, very well advanced countries with very strong institutions, where the leadership tries to be or tries to make everybody happy on every issue, and that is simply impossible to sustain, and therefore you tend to lose credibility, and that's when you start hearing or having the abrupt changes that we have observed also in some countries. So I guess what I'm suggesting is that for some countries it is the cause, and for others I think it is the root of the problem.
And Ben?
Now, the connection between the economic and the political aspects of democracy are, and they're interchangeable. It's an essential aspect of any democratic country that there's inequalities, and there's a constant struggle to bridge that divide. I think the trap that a lot of countries get in, and I certainly saw Venezuela fall into that, was the sense that there's only one type of solution to combating inequality, and that perhaps the best way to fight inequality was just to make sure that your side was on top and that the other side was down. That kind of polarized thinking that there's good guys on one side and bad guys on the other side, and you advance the interests of citizens by having one side beat the other, and ends up actually ignoring and marginalizing the very real needs of the poor, probably even worse than other systems.
We received a very important question last night, but it's also in the question and answers. So this is a topic that really is concerning people. I'm going to read Senator Jim Munson's question. When it comes to bridging divides, democratic institutions seem ill-equipped to deal with social media and the constant attacks from Twitter and other platforms. Social media has become such a powerful force undermining these institutions. Do you have ideas or strategies on how social media can be transformed to counter the constant barrage from these platforms? Does anybody want to go first on this issue? Ben?
I'm happy to. I'm not that much of an expert in social media, but I did notice the impact of widespread use of social media in Venezuela, and the polarizing effect that it can have. That without the kind of filters of, say, newspaper editors or broadcast media sort of sorting through information, with citizens just sharing it with each other, there is a natural tendency for people to gather and to separate into different groups. Let me start with a sort of positive spin on this. Thanks to social media, individual citizens have access to far more information than ever before. That's a fundamentally empowering dynamic, and as citizens have gained more and more in their knowledge, that has increased their expectations of government. It's increased their ability to criticize government, and it's increased their fear of people that have different views, perhaps gathering government. So you can see it in some sense as both an opportunity and a threat to democracy, as citizens can become now much more involved in discussions about what's happening in their country. It places a tremendous amount of pressure on these quite old and antiquated systems that we have for representing citizens. The idea that you elect someone votes once every 4 years, and then their representative goes and makes all the decisions on their behalf, and then comes back 4 years later and say, okay, yes, up or down, how am I doing? That might have worked in an age when there wasn't a lot of information to be had, and when Ottawa seemed, incredibly distant from Victoria or what have you. But now that there's like constant flow of information and space has been shrunk by social media, I don't think we solve the problem just by beating up on the social media platforms. They definitely should be regulated. I think it places a pressure also on representative institutions to adapt to 21st century society.
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly add to that. That the really tsunami of technological innovation is transforming everything. And social media, the impact on traditional media is one aspect of this. Much of this, I think, is due to the algorithms which reinforce our existing biases, reinforce our tribal identities, and make it more difficult for us to openly consider ideas. We're less tolerant of difference and different ideas. So I do think some understanding, some shifts in terms of regulatory environment are necessary. The challenge, of course, is that really needs to be done at a global level, which reinforces the importance of collaboration among societies in order to look at the good and the well-being overall. I think it's equally important, however, that we look at the way that technology is transforming the world of work. And how quickly that transformation is taking place. And I'm deeply concerned about the impact on inequality, reinforcing inequality, and the number of people who can be or who will be left behind if we actually don't look at the kinds of policy frameworks that can ensure there is more equal distribution of the benefits and protection. So, our social and our economic institutions are simply not set up to deal with change that is that rapid. And I think it's something we don't spend nearly enough time thinking about and talking about, because I do believe that it will have significant, transformational impact. Don't get me wrong, I am a believer in the potential of technology to help address a lot of the global challenges that we face. But I think we also need to be clear-eyed about the consequences and what those consequences mean for the well-being of individuals, but also the stability of our societies and the world overall.
Juan, if you don't mind, I'm going to turn another question to you, because it seems it's well within your area of expertise. We've had several questions in the chat about corruption, money laundering, that promoting this economic divide, and that the rich corrupt become leaders of so-called democracies. Maybe you could give it a solution-oriented answer to the problem of corruption in democracy.
So, to me, the roots of corruption are two. One, excessively large government, and culture or education. Let me address the first very quickly. The largest the government and the more it intervenes in people's life, the higher the corruption, because you want to do things quicker and go faster or go behind the scenes, and or because you are excessively or over-regulating and not allowing the unleashing and innovation of creativeness in as much as you could. So government has to be strong, but has to be small, and let the forces of the market play a bigger role. Having said that, there is an issue related to culture and education, certainly in some countries, where if the previous 5 or 6 or X number of generations have lived in a system that certain countries look at it from one prism and others look at it differently, they cannot measure the difference or cannot tell the difference. So it is very important to raise the level of education, the access to knowledge and technology that you were talking about before, in order to have better metrics to look at this problem and start resolving it.
Thank you very much. Now, another pivotal question that has come up, and I'm going to start with the Canadian focus, and then we can move out to the international focus. And I want to start with Ben on this one. We've received questions as to whether the institutions in Canada are fit for purpose. Are our democratic institutions that we have in Canada fit to promote and to preserve democracy?
Thank you very much. Having lived in a very polarized society that lost its democracy, essentially, and then having watched the United States with so much anxiety, the United Kingdom as well, I think, has had its brush with populism as well, and so many other countries. I do think we should take some comfort from the fact that there is still functioning institutions here, but there's a lot that could be done to change. I would start with elections. One of the questions in the chat was about the low participation in elections and what can be done about that. Australia mandates participation. I wouldn't be opposed to that, but there's something the Venezuelans do that I think would be fantastic to have here, which is to make election day a national holiday. And then not just a national holiday like the bank holiday where everyone happens to be off, but nothing happens, but to actually organize like public parties. For those of you that have been in Ottawa on July 1st, that's an insight into what election day was like traditionally in Venezuela. Massive parties, like people wearing the flag, sort of going through the streets, even like drinking and parties and fireworks and everything that if the participation in our political system through the Voting Act could be an act of celebration, collective celebration like that, I think that would be a great place to start. And then I'd like to see a lot more interaction between policymakers and decision makers and citizens throughout the period of election, and not just when it's time to go to the ballot box again.
And I see, Janet, you want to chime in here?
I think that's a lovely idea, by the way. And I think, it is a wonderful thing to be able to celebrate the fact that we do have the right to vote, and that we do have systems that are, we have trust as a society in the integrity of those systems that we don't see elsewhere in the world. So that is something that needs to be treasured and valued. I think a key part of this is to recognize that, of course, our institutions are not perfect, but they have evolved over the years, and they've evolved transparently. And I think what we need to remember is that despite that lack of perfection, if we have people of goodwill who are prepared to take on that responsibility and work within them to improve them so that they actually reflect the current challenges, but also maintain a connection to history, that's extremely important. So I also believe that the education of young people is really critical here. I don't have a huge amount of hope really for the improving the sort of what I would think of as political and democratic literacy of people my age, frankly. But I think there are so many young people who are really keen on this subject and really keen to make a difference in society. And if we can do what the University of Victoria, I think, is doing very effectively with the Students' Democratic Dialogue, then I think that we will build the kind of knowledge and skill and capability among our citizenship that can better value and participate more directly in our existing systems and continue to improve them.
Thank you. And Juan, do you have an international perspective on what democratic institutions are needed to bridge these divides?
So again, a little bit in line with what I said earlier, in many of the countries that I have worked for and where I come from, it is very important to first strengthening the trust in the existing institutions. And that is, again, you said it, it's chicken and the egg, if you have institutions that do not work, then the electoral process, for example, is not necessarily transparent or doesn't end up with the results that the majority think they will get. So what I said also before is that if you are able to give opportunities to people, there is a direct correlation between respect of institutions and economic growth and social stability. And people are less concerned when they have their needs covered and they can move forward with their lives. And I think that's a challenge. Not many governments really have been able to lead countries in that direction. But I think that's part of the work that we citizens can continue to do by asking, by pushing, by participating in opportunities like this where we learn and contrast what others are doing.
Finally, I would like to give each one of the panelists, I'm afraid we're running out of time, an opportunity to summarize, but I think you've probably been following the questions as I have. There's a real sense of despair in some of these questions. The sense that the socio-economic divide has caused such problems, and I refer you to the first question about Tunisia, where they rebuilt democratic institutions and the economy has collapsed. So the final question is for you to comment for a minute, I'm sorry, a minute or two. How do we rebuild trust in democracy nationally and internationally? And I'll start with the Honorable Janet Austin.
Thank you again, Susan. I think that we rebuild trust first and foremost by participating and by setting an example. I think those of us who are in positions of authority and power, if we have a platform, that we need to use it. We need to use it in a way that supports our institutions, not blindly, recognizes the challenges that they face, but really plays an active role. I am really very hopeful with respect to some of the challenges that we have seen this past year regarding the protests around Black Lives Matter, racism. I have certainly seen, and I'm working with major business organizations about how they actually adopt a more inclusive approach, and they're taking this very seriously. So I think that there's a lot to be hopeful for, but the primary thing is to participate, to encourage others to participate, and to use our platforms constructively and in the best interests of the citizens of our country and, frankly, the world.
Brilliant. Dr. Juan Jose Debo, I would like to give you a chance to summarize your views on how we rebuild trust.
Well, thank you again. And I think it starts at home. And I mean that literally. I think that children need to have the right references in terms of a father and a mother at home. I think they need to be taught the right principles and values by virtue of example. I think at the school level, they need to be taught more about civil values. And I think it is also very important for us, the adults, not to bend history or to try to rewrite history, but rather reflect on how to learn from what has happened in the past. And I think, especially coming from developing countries, we need to succeed by working and not by depending on others. We need to stop blaming others for the problems that are ours. In other words, each of us as individuals have the opportunity to influence positively in positive changes in our countries.
I love the notion of not rewriting history, because that seems to be what people who try to denigrate democracy do, and also the notion of individual responsibility. So thank you so much for your contribution. And finally, Mr. Ben Roswell, your perspective on how do we rebuild this trust?
Thank you. I'm going to try and address some of the ideas that have come forward. It's been a really rich discussion in the Q&A and some really interesting, tangible ideas. So I'll just run through some of them quickly, some that I think would be promising and some that are not so promising. Let me start with the ones that are not so promising. One of them about eliminating the sort of spectacle of question period in the opposition, questioning the government. I mean, that can get on people's nerves, but I think it's actually really important to hold governments to account. And if that's not happening in that somewhat kind of theatrical way inside our parliament, it's going to happen somewhere. It's going to happen in social media. It could happen in the streets. It's much better to have it in institutional bonds. And I actually think the role of the loyal opposition in parliamentary systems is something to be celebrated and not to eliminate. Another thing that I'd be cautious about is that tendency to look for some kind of villain, whether it's an outsider, the United States often being blamed because it's a powerful country, but or sometimes like big business companies, obviously, like they have power as well, but that sort of tendency to look first to someone outside who's got a malicious intent, I think removes the focus that we should have on just how hard it is for citizens to come to agreement on things and how it's important for just, us in our own context or Venezuelans in their own context to reach agreement. So we should be conscious of the role of sort of outside malicious actors, but not like think that everything begins and ends with them. Some of the things that I think are more promising, one of the speakers, I guess, had been involved in American politics where they're now experimented with something called deep canvassing, which is, sort of door-to-door knocking, but instead of having just a simple conversation of like, vote for, my guy or my woman at the next election, like they actually start to get a really profound conversation with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of citizens. We've seen some experiments with this in French with En Marche, the movement of Emmanuel Macron. That's really fascinating, and I'd love to see that take place in Canada for political parties to become much more of a two-way engine, not just like politicians trying to get elected, but for citizens to get involved. Election by referendum was mentioned so that we could bring policy issues directly to the citizens to say, do you want your taxes to go up or not? I express some caution on that. I think we've seen in countries like the United States where they have that. People always vote for taxes to come down. They never vote for taxes to come up. And as a result, you've got a complete crisis in economic and in healthcare and education. It's difficult to sort of isolate one issue in a really binding way like that in a referendum. But the alternative, which is the experiment that my organization is running, I think could be fascinating. It's called Deliberative Democracy. What happens is you take an exactly representative sample of the whole population, so 400 Canadians that look exactly like the full diversity of Canadians, educate them deeply about issues, in our case on foreign policy, and then have them tell us what those policies should be in their whole, not just like one by one, but we're essentially giving an opportunity for citizens to articulate what the vision of everyday Canadians about our role in the world should be, and then provide that to elected officials. So deliberative democracy would be an experiment that I think we should be paying close attention to.
Well, Ben, what a brilliant summation of the comments in the chat. And I just want to have a shout out to my friend Sudhir, who is a lecturer at the Gustafson School of Business, who also posed a point of view that I share, and that is the rich diversity of the Canadian experience. We can only be enhanced by increasing our diversity, increasing the tapestry of the views of Canadians who come from all over the world. And that is one of the reasons I'm so proud to be part of this conversation. This was a rich, enriching conversation. I am now going to turn it over to Ambassador Sébastien Boileau to close the session. Thank you very much to all of you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bro. I'm so happy we pulled it off. A great topic in 60 minutes. Un débat très condensé, un échange d'idées très riche sur la question de reconstruire la confiance. Very condensed and rich conversation around rebuilding trust. I say we pulled it off. Actually, our panelists and our moderator pulled it off. Thank you very much to all of you for leading us through this complex topic and with great interest of participants. J'aimerais aussi remercier les participants. Vous étiez plus d'une centaine à écouter la discussion aujourd'hui et à être inspirés par cette conversation, et puis à votre tour en inspirer d'autres et effectuer le changement nécessaire pour combler ces différences, combler les clivages. Thank you to the participants. Right after this, there will be a survey appearing on your screen. Please take a few minutes to fill it out. We really appreciate your feedback and try to adapt. We'll see you again April 1st. It's no joke. Will be the first Thursday of the month, and we'll resume with our next webinar that we'll be pleased to announce very shortly. Merci à l'Université Victoria, merci au Sénat du Canada pour cette belle collaboration. Et merci à TELUS et Van City, sans qui ce forum de Victoria ne pourrait pas avoir lieu. Thank you to you, Vic. Thank you to the Senate of Canada. Thank you to our founding partners, TELUS and Van City. Thank you very much. See you April 1st. Merci.